The gray water off Okinawa stretches to the horizon, flat and endless. It is the morning of April 6, 1945. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki stands on the observation deck at Kanoya Air Base on Kyushu, watching 355 aircraft climb into the pale sky. Most are piloted by boys barely 20 years old. None will return. This is Kikusui No. 1, Floating Chrysanthemum, the first of 10 massive kamikaze assaults designed to destroy the American invasion fleet anchored off Okinawa, 140 miles to the south. The plan is elegant in its desperation. Overwhelm American defenses with hundreds of suicide pilots striking simultaneously, sinking enough ships to force the enemy to withdraw, to negotiate, to leave Japan's sacred homeland untouched. Ugaki has sent these young men to die because he believes, he must believe, that their sacrifice will change the course of the war, that their deaths will purchase something more valuable than their lives, time, perhaps, negotiating leverage, possibly. Victory? The Admiral knows better than to speak such words aloud even to himself. But standing there in the morning light, watching those aircraft disappear into distance, Ugaki permits himself a moment of certainty. The Americans have never faced anything like this. Waves of determined pilots, each one a guided missile of flesh and explosives, crashing into carriers and battleships and destroyers. How could any fleet withstand such an onslaught? By nightfall, American radar operators will have tracked nearly 700 Japanese aircraft attempting to reach Okinawa. Ugaki's diary will record wildly optimistic claims. 5 carriers sunk, 2 battleships destroyed, numerous cruisers and destroyers sent to the bottom. The truth will be something else entirely. 10 American ships will actually be sunk or damaged beyond repair that day. The invasion fleet, over 1,300 vessels strong, will barely notice. By June, when the last kamikaze attacks sputter into futility, over 1,900 suicide pilots will be dead. The Americans will still be there, their fleet barely diminished, their troops securing Okinawa street by street. This is the story of the greatest naval suicide offensive in human history, and its complete failure to achieve a single strategic objective. It is the story of what Japanese admirals said when 5,000 kamikazes could not stop the invasion fleet. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The men who planned the kamikaze offensive were not fools. They were experienced naval officers who understood perfectly well the mathematics of their situation. By early 1945, Japan's position was hopeless by any rational calculation. The combined fleet lay scattered across the Pacific floor. The Navy had fewer than 2,000 operational aircraft remaining. Trained pilots were critically scarce. Most of the experienced aviators had died over the Philippines or in earlier battles. Fuel reserves approached zero. Industrial capacity had collapsed under American bombing. Against this backdrop of comprehensive defeat, the United States assembled an invasion armada that would have been unimaginable 3 years earlier. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, required over 1,300 ships, 40 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, 200 cruisers and destroyers, hundreds of transports and supply vessels. The logistics alone represented a demonstration of industrial power so vast it bordered on the surreal. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet carried 182,000 American troops toward Okinawa. The invasion force included the Army's 10th Army, 4 infantry divisions, and 3 Marine divisions. The fleet's aircraft carriers alone operated more combat aircraft than remained in the entire Japanese military. Standing in headquarters at Kanoya, studying intelligence reports about the approaching armada, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki understood these numbers with brutal clarity. The 53-year-old admiral had served as chief of staff to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto during the Pearl Harbor attack and had survived the same aircraft ambush that killed Yamamoto in 1943. Ugaki kept detailed diaries throughout the war, offering historians a rare window into Japanese command thinking during these desperate final months. His diary entries from March 1945 reveal a man confronting impossible choices. Conventional air attacks had proven utterly ineffective. Japanese pilots attempting orthodox bombing runs against American ships were shot down in overwhelming numbers by radar-directed anti-aircraft fire and combat air patrols. The few bombs that found targets rarely caused critical damage. American damage control techniques had become so sophisticated that even badly hit vessels often returned to action within hours or days. The mathematics were stark. Japan might launch 100 conventional bombing sorties and achieve perhaps 2 hits, damaging 1 or 2 ships. The cost in aircraft and trained pilots made such attacks unsustainable. Suicide attacks changed the equation. A kamikaze pilot aimed not at a target, but at becoming the weapon itself. Aircraft loaded with explosives, flown directly into enemy ships with the pilot's body serving as the guidance system. If the pilot reached his target, if he could penetrate the defensive screen, evade the anti-aircraft fire, and crash into a ship, the results could be devastating. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot, 1 ship damaged or sunk. The calculus became almost reasonable, viewed through the lens of absolute desperation. The concept had emerged during the Philippines campaign in October 1944. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, had organized the first official kamikaze units when conventional tactics proved incapable of stopping American naval forces approaching the Philippines. Early results seemed promising. Several escort carriers were hit, 1 was sunk, and American fleet operations were temporarily disrupted. Imperial Navy headquarters seized on these results as proof that suicide tactics could work. By January 1945, kamikaze attacks had been systematized, formalized, and expanded. The 5th Air Fleet, under Ugaki's operational control, became the primary kamikaze force designated to defend Okinawa and the southern home islands. The plan Ugaki developed was called Operation Tengo, Operation Heaven, though the name carried more than a trace of bitter irony. 10 massive kamikaze assaults, each comprising hundreds of aircraft, would be launched against the American fleet anchored off Okinawa. These mass attacks were designated kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, evoking images of scattered flower petals drifting on water. The symbolism was deliberate. In Japanese culture, cherry blossoms and chrysanthemums represented the ephemeral nature of life, beauty in transience, the warrior's acceptance of death. The pilots themselves wore hachimaki headbands inscribed with patriotic slogans, carried photographs of the emperor, and wrote final letters to their families before climbing into aircraft they knew they would never land. The operational plan assumed that approximately 3,500 naval aircraft and 2,500 Army aircraft would participate in the 10 Kikusui attacks between April and June 1945. Roughly half would be designated for suicide missions. The remainder would serve as escorts, guiding the less experienced kamikaze pilots toward their targets and engaging American fighters to create openings for the suicide aircraft to penetrate defensive screens. Japanese planners calculated that if 1 in 6 kamikaze aircraft hit a target, a 17% success rate, the cumulative damage would sink or disable hundreds of American ships. Mathematical projections suggested that such losses would make continuing the invasion operationally impossible, forcing American commanders to withdraw and compelling Washington to negotiate a conditional peace that might preserve the imperial system and Japan's sovereignty. These calculations contained several critical flaws that would become apparent only in execution. First, they dramatically underestimated American anti-aircraft capabilities and the resilience of American warships to damage. Second, they assumed the Americans would not adapt their defensive tactics as the campaign progressed. Third, they presumed that Japanese forces could sustain the tempo of mass attacks over multiple months despite fuel shortages, aircraft attrition, and the depleting pool of available pilots. Most fundamentally, the plan assumed that inflicting casualties and sinking ships would translate into strategic victory. The Japanese command structure struggled to comprehend the industrial reality of 1945 America. Even grievous losses could be absorbed. Ships could be replaced. Casualties, however tragic, would not break American strategic resolve. The United States was willing to pay almost any price to achieve unconditional surrender. Ugaki himself seems to have understood this on some level. His diary entries oscillate between expressions of confidence and moments of stark realism. He writes of pilots departing with smiles, knowing they march toward certain death. He records his own resolution to eventually follow them, to die in the same manner as the young men he sends to destruction. But beneath the rhetoric of duty and sacrifice runs a current of profound doubt. On the morning of April 6th, watching those aircraft disappear toward Okinawa, Ugaki surely knew that Operation Tengo represented less a genuine strategy than a final gesture of defiance. The young pilots climbing into their cockpits might believe their deaths would save Japan. The Admiral sending them had no such illusions. He was ordering mass suicide because no other options remained. The Americans detected the incoming raid approximately 70 miles north of Okinawa. Radar operators aboard the fleet's picket destroyers, vessels stationed in a protective ring around the main invasion force, tracked multiple large formations approaching from Kyushu. By early afternoon on April the 6th, it became clear this was no ordinary attack. The scope and coordination suggested something unprecedented. What followed was 19 hours of sustained aerial combat, the most intense single day of kamikaze attacks in naval history. Japanese aircraft attacked in multiple waves, attempting to saturate American defenses by striking from different directions simultaneously. Some formations targeted the radar picket destroyers stationed at exposed positions north and west of Okinawa. Others attempted to penetrate deeper toward the carriers and battleships in the main fleet. A few sought out the vulnerable transport vessels and supply ships anchored in Hagushi Bay on Okinawa's western coast. American combat air patrols, flights of Hellcat and Corsair fighters maintained continuously over the fleet, engaged the incoming raids at maximum range. Fighter directors aboard the picket destroyers vectored these interceptors toward the largest formations, attempting to break up the attacks before kamikaze pilots could reach visual range of the fleet. The fighter pilots faced a unique tactical challenge. Conventional enemy bombers could be frightened away. Aggressive maneuvering, close passes, warning shots. These tactics often convinced ordinary pilots to jettison their bombs and flee. Kamikaze pilots never turned back. They flew straight toward their targets, regardless of damage, regardless of odds. Many continued flying even with wings shredded by gunfire, engines smoking, fuselages riddled with holes. Only complete destruction of the aircraft or instant death of the pilot could prevent an attack. American pilots learned to aim for the engine or the cockpit, to destroy the kamikaze so completely that the resulting wreckage could not reach its target even in an uncontrolled dive. It was brutal, exhausting work. By day's end, American fighters claimed to have shot down over 250 Japanese aircraft. Many more fell to the withering anti-aircraft fire of the fleet itself. The destroyers on picket duty bore the brunt of the assault. These vessels, positioned miles away from the main fleet to provide early warning, were often the first ships kamikaze pilots encountered. Inexperienced pilots, struggling to navigate in their first combat mission, would simply attack the first American vessel they saw rather than attempting to reach the more valuable carriers and battleships farther south. USS Bush, stationed at Radar Picket Station 1 northwest of Okinawa, was struck by 3 kamikaze aircraft in succession. The first crashed into the ship's port side near the forward gun mount. The second hit amidships, triggering a massive explosion in the engineering spaces. The third struck the already burning vessel minutes later. Bush sank within an hour, taking 94 men with her. USS Colquhoun, racing to assist Bush, absorbed 4 kamikaze hits in less than an hour. The destroyer's crew fought fires and flooding heroically, but ultimately had to abandon ship. 35 men died. The destroyer USS Newcomb survived 4 kamikaze crashes, but was so badly damaged she had to be towed from the combat zone. Yet even amid this carnage, a pattern emerged that Japanese commanders would struggle to accept. The invasion fleet continued operations. Ships were hit, ships were damaged, ships burned and sank. But the Armada did not withdraw. For every vessel knocked out of action, 10 more remained operational. Damaged ships were simply towed to rear anchorages for repair or sent back to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast, their places immediately taken by undamaged vessels from the vast reserve Spruance held in readiness. By nightfall on April 6th, American losses totaled 6 ships sunk or damaged beyond repair. Another 18 vessels suffered significant damage, requiring weeks of repair work. American casualties numbered approximately 500 killed and an equivalent number wounded. These were the worst single-day naval losses the United States had suffered since Guadalcanal. In Kanoya, Ugaki's staff compiled action reports from returning escort pilots and interpreted radio intercepts suggesting massive American losses. The Admiral's diary entry for April 6th records his belief that the Kikusui attack had sunk or damaged dozens of major American warships, perhaps crippling the invasion fleet. The reality was vastly different. The invasion of Okinawa proceeded exactly on schedule. American troops continued landing without naval gunfire, support being interrupted. Carrier aircraft continued flying sorties. The vast logistical apparatus bringing supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements to the island operated without pause. One day of kamikaze attacks, no matter how intensive, could not materially affect the outcome of the campaign. The industrial and military power disparity between the two nations had grown so immense that even spectacular tactical successes translated into strategic irrelevance. This pattern would repeat itself 9 more times over the next 10 weeks, with increasingly diminishing returns. Kikusui No. 2 launched on April 11th and 12th. Approximately 185 kamikaze aircraft attacked over 2 days. The battleship USS Missouri was hit by a Zero that crashed into the starboard side below the main deck, causing minor damage and no casualties. The carrier USS Enterprise absorbed a bomb hit but continued operations. 2 destroyers and several smaller vessels were damaged. Japanese pilots reported sinking multiple carriers and battleships. American records show no capital ships were lost. The fleet continued operations without interruption. Kikusui No. 3 came on April 15th and 16th, 165 suicide aircraft. The destroyer USS Pringle was hit and sunk, 62 men killed. The destroyer USS Laffey, in what would become one of the war's most famous defensive actions, survived hits by 4 bombs and 5 kamikaze aircraft at the cost of 32 dead and 71 wounded. The ship earned the nickname, the ship that would not die. Japanese command believed this attack had devastated the American fleet. Ugaki's diary claims multiple carriers sunk. In reality, no carriers were lost. The invasion continued. Kikusui No. 4 on April 27th and 28th launched approximately 115 kamikazes. Several destroyers and smaller vessels were damaged. The hospital ship USS Comfort, fully illuminated with Red Cross markings and operating 50 miles from Okinawa under protection of the Geneva Convention, was deliberately struck by a kamikaze that killed 29 personnel, including 6 Army nurses. The attack on a clearly marked hospital ship revealed either the desperation or the brutality or both that characterized the kamikaze campaign's final weeks. No carriers were sunk, no battleships lost. The fleet remained. By early May, a grim realization began permeating Japanese naval headquarters. The Kikusui attacks were failing to achieve their strategic objective. Ships were being damaged, men were being killed, but the American advance continued unabated. More troubling, American defensive tactics were evolving rapidly to counter the suicide attacks. The combat air patrols became more aggressive, establishing layered defensive zones that forced kamikaze formations to fight through multiple waves of interceptors before reaching the fleet. Radar picket stations were reinforced with additional destroyers and landing craft carrying extra anti-aircraft guns. The fleet developed specialized jack patrols, small groups of fighters stationed at low altitude around the task force, specifically positioned to intercept kamikaze pilots attempting to sneak in at wave-top height. Most significantly, American gunners were learning to shoot more effectively at suicide aircraft. The advent of proximity-fused shells for 5-inch and 40mm anti-aircraft guns dramatically increased kill rates. These VT, variable time fuses, used miniature radar sets to detonate shells when they passed near an aircraft, creating expanding clouds of shrapnel that could destroy incoming kamikazes even without direct hits. Combined with improved fire control radar and automated gun-laying systems, American anti-aircraft defenses became extraordinarily lethal by mid-May 1945. The hit rate for kamikaze attacks, initially around 17% in the Philippines, dropped to roughly 9% at Okinawa, then fell further as the campaign progressed. By June, fewer than 1 in 15 kamikaze sorties resulted in hits on American ships, yet the attacks continued. Kikusui 5 through 10 launched between May 3rd and June 22nd, expending over 1,000 additional aircraft and pilots in suicide attacks that achieved progressively less with each passing week. The human cost was staggering. Japanese records indicate that approximately 2,400 kamikaze pilots died during the Okinawa campaign. Many were university students, pulled from their studies and given a few weeks of flight training before being sent to die. Some were experienced pilots who volunteered for suicide missions out of genuine patriotic fervor or fatalistic acceptance that death was inevitable regardless. Others were coerced through psychological pressure, military discipline, and cultural expectations that made refusing a suicide mission socially impossible. The psychological toll on both sides was immense. American sailors developed what would later be recognized as symptoms of combat stress disorder. Men stationed on the radar picket destroyers, knowing they would be the first targets, that their ships lacked the defensive firepower of larger vessels, showed increasing rates of what was then called operational fatigue. Some ships' crews reported being on the verge of breaking down completely after weeks of sustained kamikaze attacks. For the Japanese pilots themselves, the experience defied simple categorization. Some accounts describe genuine volunteers who embraced death for the emperor with something approaching religious fervor. Other testimonies reveal young men terrified of dying, coerced into missions they privately considered futile, writing farewell letters that expressed profound ambivalence about the sacrifice demanded of them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The final Kikusui attack, Number 10, launched on June 21st and 22nd. By this point, Japan's remaining air assets had been reduced to barely functional aircraft flown by pilots with sometimes fewer than 50 hours of total flight time. Formations struggled to even locate Okinawa, much less successfully attack the American fleet. Many aircraft ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean en route to the target. Others were shot down so easily that American combat air patrol pilots reported the intercepts felt more like target practice than combat. On the ground, the Battle of Okinawa reached its conclusion around the same time. Japanese defensive forces, having conducted a brilliant delaying campaign across the island's southern mountains, finally collapsed under relentless American pressure. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, committed ritual suicide on June 21st. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the Army's senior surviving staff officer, surrendered the remaining forces. With organized resistance ended, there was no longer any strategic purpose to kamikaze attacks. The island had fallen. The invasion could not be stopped. Yet even in defeat, the psychological commitment to suicide tactics persisted. Admiral Ugaki spent the summer of 1945 in a state that his diary reveals as something close to psychological disintegration. His entries became increasingly disconnected from reality, claiming wildly inflated kill numbers that bore no relationship to actual American losses. He wrote of enemy fleets annihilated that continued operating at full strength. He described strategic victories that existed only in his imagination. On April 11th, Ugaki had written in his diary that American forces had suffered confirmed losses of 5 carriers, 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 2 cruisers, and 1 unidentified ship sunk, all in a single attack. In reality, not a single carrier or battleship had been sunk at any point during the Okinawa campaign. By June, his diary entries shifted from delusional claims of victory to reflections on death and honor. He wrote increasingly of following his pilots into death, of accepting personal responsibility for the failure to stop the American advance. He began planning what he called his final duty, a last kamikaze mission that would allow him to die in the same manner as the men he had sent to their deaths. The other architects of the kamikaze program responded to failure in various ways. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the man who had first proposed organizing suicide attack units in October 1944, maintained until the end that kamikaze tactics represented Japan's only hope of avoiding total destruction. In his final weeks, Onishi advocated for continuing suicide attacks even against American invasion forces expected to land on the home islands, arguing that inflicting massive casualties might still force a negotiated surrender. At the Naval General Staff, younger officers who had championed the kamikaze concept struggled to reconcile their strategic theories with battlefield reality. They had believed, genuinely believed, that American resolve would crack under sustained casualties, that Washington's democratic system and casualty-averse public opinion would force negotiations once losses reached a certain threshold. This represented a fundamental misreading of American strategic culture and political will. The United States in 1945 was willing to accept almost unlimited casualties to achieve unconditional surrender. Public opinion, far from demanding negotiations, supported continued prosecution of the war with increasing ruthlessness. The kamikaze attacks, rather than weakening American resolve, had the opposite effect, hardening attitudes and reinforcing determination to completely destroy Japan's capacity for war. The final accounting of the kamikaze campaign at Okinawa reveals both its tactical effectiveness and strategic futility. Over approximately 3 months, Japanese forces launched roughly 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the American fleet. These attacks sank 36 ships and damaged 368 others. American naval casualties totaled 4,900 killed and 4,800 wounded. the highest losses the U.S. Navy suffered in any single campaign during the war. Yet for all this destruction, for all these deaths, the strategic situation remained unchanged. Okinawa was conquered. American forces established massive air bases and naval facilities on the island. The final barrier protecting the Japanese home islands had fallen. The invasion fleet that Japanese planners had hoped to cripple or destroy sat anchored in Okinawan waters, stronger than ever, preparing for the next operation. No carriers had been sunk, no battleships lost. The cruisers and destroyers that were damaged could be and were quickly replaced. The American fleet's operational capacity had barely diminished despite months of sustained suicide attacks. Japanese Naval Command was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had spent their remaining air power, killed their remaining pilots, and expended their remaining aircraft, achieving nothing of strategic value. The invasion could not be stopped. American industrial and military superiority was so overwhelming that even the most desperate measures proved inadequate. The human cost of this strategic failure weighed heavily on the Japanese officers who had planned and executed the operation. Admiral Ugaki, in particular, seems to have been psychologically destroyed by the experience. His diary entries from July and August 1945 reveal a man detached from reality, finding solace in Buddhist philosophy and heavy drinking. He wrote to himself that he could send young men to die with a smile, because he had resolved to follow their example. He described his weak mind, apt to be moved to tears, as having reached a state where death had become acceptable, even desirable. One senses in these passages a man rationalizing decisions he knows were morally indefensible, seeking philosophical justification for actions that resulted in the deaths of thousands. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, unconditional surrender. The war was over. Admiral Ugaki listened to the broadcast at Kanoya Air Base. He then made the final entry in his war diary. The passage is remarkable for its combination of bureaucratic detail and emotional devastation. I alone am to blame for our failure to defend the homeland and destroy the arrogant enemy. The valiant efforts of all officers and men of my command during the past 6 months have been greatly appreciated. I am going to make an attack at Okinawa, where my men have fallen like cherry blossoms. I will crash into and destroy the arrogant enemy in true samurai fashion. Ugaki removed all rank insignia from his uniform. He kept only a short ceremonial sword, a gift from Admiral Yamamoto, and a pair of binoculars. He had photographs taken showing himself in this simplified uniform, standing calmly before departure. Then he walked to a Yokosuka D4Y Suisei dive bomber and ordered the assigned radio man, Warrant Officer Akiyoshi Endo, to leave the aircraft. Endo refused. He physically pushed his way back into the cramped rear seat, squeezing in next to Ugaki despite the Admiral's direct orders to stand down. Other pilots, hearing of Ugaki's intention, insisted on accompanying him. Eventually, 11 aircraft carrying 23 men prepared to depart on what everyone knew was a suicide mission ordered in direct defiance of the Emperor's command to lay down arms. The Admiral's close friend, Vice Admiral Joshima Takagi, made a final attempt to dissuade him, arguing that Ugaki had responsibilities to the future, not just to the past. The Admiral listened politely, then climbed into the aircraft anyway. The formation departed Kanoya at approximately 1900 hours on August 15th. They flew southwest toward Okinawa, navigating through gathering darkness. At 1924 hours, Ugaki transmitted his final message via Morse code. I am going to crash into the arrogant enemy. Despite the brave fighting of every unit under my command over the past 6 months, we failed to destroy the arrogant enemy, a failure due to my inadequacy. American radar detected the incoming aircraft. The formation likely approached the small island of Ihejima, north of Okinawa, where U.S. forces maintained facilities. Anti-aircraft batteries engaged. American night fighters scrambled. What happened next is unclear. 3 of the 11 aircraft returned to Kyushu claiming engine trouble. Their crews apparently chose life over death at the last moment. The remaining 8 aircraft disappeared. No reports of successful attacks were ever recorded. No American ships reported damage from aerial attacks that evening. The following morning, Navy personnel on Ihejima discovered wreckage of a crashed Japanese aircraft on the beach. Inside the smoldering cockpit, they found 3 bodies. One wore a green uniform and carried a short sword. This was identified as Admiral Ugaki. He had failed even in death. His final kamikaze mission, like so many thousands before it, accomplished nothing. The Americans buried the bodies in the sand. The war was over. Ugaki received posthumous promotion and honors from a government that would soon cease to exist. The kamikaze campaign at Okinawa stands as perhaps the most concentrated expression of military futility in modern warfare. Almost 2,000 young men died flying suicide missions against an enemy they could not defeat, in service of objectives that could not be achieved, following orders issued by commanders who had no realistic hope of success. What did Japanese admirals say when 5,000 kamikazes, counting all campaigns, not just Okinawa, failed to stop the invasion fleet? The historical record suggests they said very little publicly. There were no formal assessments admitting failure, no strategic reviews acknowledging that suicide tactics had proven ineffective. Instead, there was silence, ritual suicide, and the gradual acceptance that Japan's military position had become absolutely hopeless. In private documents, diaries, letters, interrogation records, Japanese naval officers revealed a more complex picture. Some expressed genuine surprise that American forces could absorb such punishment and continue operations. Others admitted they had known from the beginning that kamikaze attacks could not change the war's outcome, but felt compelled to order them anyway, to demonstrate fighting spirit, to fulfill cultural expectations about honorable death. A few, like Ugaki, descended into something resembling madness, their grip on reality loosening as the gap between their reported successes and actual results grew impossibly wide. Their diaries record victories that never occurred, fleets destroyed that continued operating, strategic triumphs that existed only in imagination. The truth was simpler and more terrible. The kamikaze campaign achieved tactical effects, but strategic irrelevance. It killed thousands on both sides, damaged hundreds of ships, created psychological trauma that would last generations, and accomplished nothing that mattered. The invasion could not be stopped. The war was lost. All the dying changed nothing except the body count. In the end, what Japanese admirals said when their desperate final gamble failed was nothing at all. They killed themselves. They fled into denial. They accepted the inevitable. But they could not acknowledge that they had spent the lives of their youngest citizens purchasing only a few weeks' delay of an outcome that had been determined by industrial capacity, strategic geography, and political will long before the first kamikaze ever lifted off. The kamikaze campaign was Japan's final gesture of defiance in a war it had lost the moment it began. The tragedy was not that it failed. The tragedy was that it was ever attempted at all. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.